Robert Chen pushed his cleaning cart down the long hallway of the Riverside Performing Arts Center, his footsteps echoing in the early morning silence. It was 5:30 a.m. and the building was completely empty. This was his favorite time of day. No crowds, no noise, just him and the beautiful building he'd been taking care of for the past 12 years. He was 58 years old now, and his body reminded him of that fact every morning when he climbed out of bed. His knees ached a little, his back wasn't what it used to be, but he never complained. This job had given him something most people didn't understand. It had given him access to something precious. Robert pulled out his keys and unlocked the supply closet on the 3rd floor. Inside were his mops, buckets, cleaning solutions, and all the tools he needed to keep the center spotless. He'd learned every corner of this place over the years. He knew which bathroom faucets dripped, which floor tiles were loose, and exactly how long it took to vacuum the main lobby. The Riverside Performing Arts Center wasn't just any building. It was one of the most beautiful places in the entire city. Rich people came here in fancy clothes to watch concerts, ballets, and operas. The walls were covered in cream-colored marble, and huge crystal chandeliers hung from the ceilings like frozen waterfalls. Red velvet curtains framed the main stage, and the seats in the concert hall were soft and comfortable. Nothing like the hard plastic chairs in regular movie theaters. Robert started his morning routine the same way he always did. First, he emptied all the trash cans in the administrative offices. Then he dusted the picture frames in the hallway, the ones showing famous musicians who had performed here over the years. Their faces stared out from behind the glass, frozen in moments of triumph. Sometimes Robert wondered what their lives had been like. Did they always know they'd be famous? Or did they have doubts too? As he worked, people started arriving. The administrative staff came in around 8, carrying their coffee cups and briefcases. They walked past Robert with quick smiles and distracted nods. "Morning," they'd say, but they never stopped to chat. To them, he was just part of the building, like the furniture or the paintings on the walls. The musicians arrived later, usually around 10. They carried instrument cases and sheet music, talking and laughing with each other about things Robert couldn't quite hear. Sometimes he'd catch pieces of their conversations. Things like, "Did you hear about the new conductor?" Or, "The acoustics in Studio B are terrible." They spoke a different language, one that belonged to a world Robert could only watch from the outside, or so they thought. By noon, Robert had cleaned 3 bathrooms, mopped 2 hallways, and replaced all the paper towels in the building. He took his lunch break in the small staff room in the basement, eating the sandwich he'd packed that morning. Usually tuna or turkey, nothing fancy. He sat alone at the small table, listening to the sounds of the building above him. Footsteps, voices, occasional laughter. Life happening somewhere else. In the afternoon, he focused on the main concert hall. This was his favorite space to clean, but also the one that made his heart ache the most. The hall could seat 800 people, and every seat had a perfect view of the stage. The acoustics were amazing. Even a whisper on stage could be heard in the back row. And in the center of that stage sat the most beautiful instrument Robert had ever seen. A Steinway grand piano, black and glossy, its surface so polished he could see his reflection in it. He cleaned around it carefully, never touching the keys. That wasn't his place. He was just the janitor. But Robert had a secret he'd kept for 12 years, ever since he started working here. A secret that would have shocked every single person who walked past him without a second glance. As evening came, the building got busier. Tonight there was a chamber music concert, and well-dressed people started arriving around 7. Robert watched them from his position near the side entrance where he was replacing a light bulb. The women wore long dresses and sparkly jewelry. The men had on suits that probably cost more than Robert made in a month. They spoke in the confident voices of people who belonged in places like this. Robert finished his work in the public areas before the concert started. He couldn't be visible once the audience was seated. That was one of the rules. Janitors should be invisible, so he retreated to the backstage area, continuing his work where no one could see him. He could hear the music through the walls. Beethoven tonight, string quartet. The notes floated through the building like something alive, weaving through the hallways and stairwells. Robert paused in his work, closing his eyes and just listening. His grandmother had loved Beethoven. She'd played his music on the old upright piano in their tiny apartment when Robert was a boy. That piano had been his whole world once, His grandmother had taught him to play when he was just 5 years old. His small fingers had struggled to reach the keys at first, but she'd been patient. Music is a gift, she used to say. And gifts are meant to be shared. Robert had been good. Really good. Good enough that his high school music teacher had helped him apply for a scholarship to the conservatory. He'd gotten in too, a partial scholarship that covered half the tuition. But half wasn't enough. His family couldn't afford the rest. His father had died when Robert was 16, and his mother worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. There was no money for music school no matter how talented he was, so Robert had made a choice. He'd gotten a regular job instead, first in a factory, then as a security guard, and eventually as a janitor. He'd told himself it was okay. He'd told himself that music could just be a hobby, something he did for fun, but it had never felt like enough. The concert ended around 9:30. Robert waited backstage listening to the applause, imagining what it would feel like to be on the receiving end of that sound. Then the audience left, their voices fading as they headed to their cars. The musicians packed up their instruments. The staff locked up their offices and went home. By 11 o'clock, Robert was alone again. He pushed his cart to the storage room and put away his supplies. Then he walked back to the main concert hall, his heart beating faster with every step. The stage lights were off, but he knew his way in the dark. He'd done this hundreds of times before. Robert sat down at the Steinway piano. His reflection stared back at him from the polished black surface. An old man in a janitor's uniform, sitting where famous pianists sat. It should have felt wrong, but it didn't. This was the only time Robert felt truly himself. He placed his hands on the keys, feeling their familiar coolness under his fingers. Then he began to play. Chopin Tonight, a nocturne, soft and sad and beautiful. The notes filled the empty hall, echoing off the walls and reaching all 800 empty seats. This was Robert's real life. Not the mopping or the dusting or the polite nods from people who didn't really see him. These stolen hours with the piano, playing for an audience that didn't exist. He played until his fingers were tired and his heart was full. Then he stood up, adjusted the piano bench back to exactly where it had been, and walked away. Tomorrow he'd come back and clean the hall again. And tomorrow night, if he was lucky, he'd play again. Nobody knew. Nobody needed to know. This secret was his, and it was enough. Or at least that's what Robert had convinced himself over the past 12 years. He had no idea that everything was about to change. But because music made her happy. The 3rd week of October was always crazy at the Riverside Performing Arts Center. That's when they held the annual charity gala, the biggest event of the year. Robert had seen it happen 12 times now, and every year it was the same beautiful chaos. This year felt different, though. There was an electric energy in the air, an excitement that Robert could feel even as he cleaned the floors and emptied the trash cans. The reason was simple. Victoria Cross was coming. Victoria Cross wasn't just any pianist. She was the pianist. The one who'd played at Carnegie Hall when she was only 19. The one who'd recorded 15 albums and won awards that Robert couldn't even pronounce. Magazine covers, television appearances, sold-out concerts all over the world. She was as close to royalty as the classical music world had. And she was going to play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 at the Riverside Gala. Robert had heard the staff talking about it for months. They'd sold out all 800 seats within 3 hours of announcing Victoria's performance. People had paid $500 per ticket, and some had flown in from other states just to be there. The money raised would go to the city's youth music programs, helping kids who couldn't afford instruments or lessons. Robert knew Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto intimately. It was one of the most beautiful and technically challenging pieces ever written. Sweeping melodies, thundering chords, delicate passages that required absolute precision. He'd spent the last 2 years learning it, practicing late at night on that Steinway piano when everyone else had gone home. His fingers knew every note, every phrase, every emotional peak and valley. Of course, nobody knew that. The gala was scheduled for Saturday night, exactly 1 week away. Robert watched as the staff transformed the center into something even more spectacular than usual. They brought in extra flowers, polished everything until it gleamed, and hung elegant banners in the lobby. The excitement was contagious, even for someone like Robert who would never actually attend the event. On Monday morning, Robert arrived at his usual time and immediately sensed something was wrong. The building had a different feeling, like a storm was brewing. He found out why when he reached the administrative offices around 7:30. Diana Park, the event coordinator, was on the phone. Her voice carried through the closed door, high-pitched and stressed. "But there has to be something you can do. The event is in 6 days."
6 days!
Robert knocked quietly and entered to empty her trash can, trying to be invisible as always. Diana barely glanced at him, too focused on her phone call. Her desk was covered in papers, coffee cups, and her computer screen showed what looked like a very complicated spreadsheet. "I understand she's sick," Diana was saying. Her hand pressed against her forehead. "But surely." No, I understand. Yes, thank you anyway." She hung up and immediately started dialing another number. Robert worked slowly, wiping down the surfaces, changing the trash bag. He couldn't help but hear. "Hi, this is Diana Park from Riverside Performing Arts Center. I'm calling about a potential performance opportunity this Saturday night." "Yes, I know it's short notice. Rachmaninoff's second piano concerto with full orchestra. You're in Tokyo, right, of course. Thank you anyway." Another call. "Mr. Harrison's office?" "Yes, I need to speak with him urgently about a performance opportunity." "He's recovering from hand surgery." "I see. When will he be able to play again?" 3 months. "Okay. Thank you." Robert finished cleaning and quietly left, but he couldn't stop thinking about what he'd heard. Something had happened to Victoria Cross, something bad. By Tuesday, the rumors were flying through the building. Robert heard different versions from different people. Victoria had the flu. Victoria had broken her hand. Victoria had food poisoning. Nobody seemed to know the truth, but everyone knew the gala was in serious trouble. Robert was cleaning the main hallway when he overheard 2 orchestra members talking. "I heard it's some kind of inflammation," the violinist said. "Started in her throat, but somehow affected her hands too. The doctor said absolutely no performing for at least 3 weeks. What's Diana going to do?" the cellist asked. "You can't just replace Victoria Cross. She's a legend." "I know. And the Rach too? That's not something just anyone can play on 6 days' notice. This is a disaster." They walked away, shaking their heads. Robert stood there, his mop dripping water onto the floor he'd just cleaned. Rachmaninoff's second. 3 weeks recovery. 6 days until the performance. His heart was beating fast and he didn't quite know why. Over the next few days, Robert watched Diana make phone call after phone call. Every famous pianist she contacted was either already booked, too far away, or unwilling to learn such a difficult piece on such short notice. Some were sympathetic. Others were almost offended by the last-minute request. By Thursday, Diana looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were red, and she'd started talking to herself, muttering names of pianists and checking them off a list. The donors were getting anxious. The orchestra was worried. Everyone was asking the same question. What happens if we can't find a replacement? The gala couldn't be postponed. The donors had made travel plans, the orchestra had been hired, the caterers were already preparing food, and the tickets clearly stated no refunds. Besides, the youth music programs were counting on this money. Hundreds of kids needed instruments and lessons they couldn't afford otherwise. Robert went about his work, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept thinking about that piano sitting alone on the stage. He thought about Rachmaninoff's concerto. Every note of it burned into his memory from countless nights of practice. He thought about Victoria Cross, sick somewhere, unable to play. He thought about Diana's increasingly desperate phone calls. And he thought about something his grandmother had told him long ago. Music is a gift, and gifts are meant to be shared. But who was he kidding? He was 58 years old, a janitor with sore knees and calloused hands. He hadn't played for a real audience in over 30 years. The last time he'd performed in public, he'd been a nervous teenager at a high school recital. The idea of walking onto that stage in front of 800 people, playing with a full orchestra, performing one of the most difficult pieces in the classical piano repertoire. It was insane. Friday evening came, less than 24 hours before the gala. Robert finished his regular duties and knew the orchestra would be rehearsing. They'd been practicing all week, learning to play the concerto without a soloist. It sounded strange and incomplete, like a conversation with one person missing. He stayed in the back hallway listening as they ran through the piece again. The conductor kept stopping, his frustration clear in his voice. "From measure 185 again, and remember, When we have a soloist, you'll need to follow their tempo. If we have a soloist. That last part was said quietly, but Robert heard it. The defeat in his voice. The acceptance that tomorrow night might be a disaster. The rehearsal ended around 10. Robert waited, listening to the orchestra members pack up their instruments and leave. He heard the conductor talking to Diana in the lobby, their voices tired and sad. "We'll do our best tomorrow," the conductor said. "Maybe we can play some other pieces. Adjust the program." "I've failed them," Diana said softly. "All those kids counting on this money, and I've failed them." Their voices faded as they left the building. Soon Robert was alone again. Just him and the empty center, the way it always was at this time of night. He walked to the concert hall slowly, his cleaning cart forgotten. The stage lights were off, but the emergency lights cast a soft glow over everything. The Steinway piano sat there waiting, patient and beautiful as always. Robert sat down at the bench. His hands were shaking slightly and his heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He placed his fingers on the keys, took a deep breath, and began to play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. The opening chords filled the empty hall, powerful and emotional. Robert closed his eyes and let the music take over. His fingers moved across the keys with the confidence that came from hundreds of hours of practice. The first movement flowed into the second, those achingly beautiful melodies that made people cry. Then the third movement, technical and demanding and triumphant. He played the entire concerto without stopping, without a single mistake. Every note was exactly where it should be. Every phrase had the right emotion. When he finished, his hands were trembling and his eyes were wet. Then he heard something that made his blood freeze. Applause. A single person clapping, the sound echoing in the nearly empty hall. Robert spun around on the bench, his heart nearly stopping. Diana Park stood in the back of the hall near the entrance, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Her purse had fallen to the floor, forgotten. She walked down the center aisle slowly, never taking her eyes off Robert. When she reached the stage, she stared up at him like she was seeing a ghost. "How?" she whispered. "How is this possible?" Robert opened his mouth but couldn't find any words. His secret, the thing he'd guarded for 12 years, was suddenly out in the open. His hands were still shaking, and he didn't know if it was from the music or from fear. Diana climbed the steps to the stage, moving closer. "How long have you been able to play like that?" Robert finally found his voice. "A long time," he said quietly. "Since I was a kid." She stared at him and he could see her mind working, putting pieces together. "You play here at night. That's why the piano bench is sometimes in a different position in the morning. I thought the night cleaning crew was moving it." Robert nodded, unable to meet her eyes. Diana was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that changed everything. "Can you do it again?" "Do what?" Robert asked, confused. "Play that piece. Tomorrow night. On that stage. In front of 800 people." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Robert gripped the piano bench to steady himself. I can't, I'm just—" "You're a pianist," Diana said firmly. "I just heard you. That was perfect. That was better than perfect. That was—" She paused, her eyes shining with tears. "That was everything." Robert's mind was spinning. Tomorrow night. A real audience. A full orchestra. Everything he'd dreamed about and given up on 30 years ago. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. Diana smiled, and for the first time all week it was a real smile. "I know," she said. "But will you do it anyway?" Robert didn't sleep that night. How could he? He lay in bed in his small apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation with Diana over and over in his mind. He'd said yes. After 30 years of hiding, of playing only for empty seats and his own satisfaction, he'd agreed to perform in front of 800 people. With a full orchestra, at the biggest event of the year. What had he been thinking? At 4 a.m. he gave up on sleep and made coffee. His hands were still shaking as he poured water into the machine. He sat at his small kitchen table, the same table where he'd eaten breakfast for the past 20 years, and wondered if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. His phone rang at 6 a.m. It was Diana. "Good morning, Robert. I hope I didn't wake you. Can you come in early today? We need to run through the piece with the orchestra before tonight." Robert's stomach dropped. The orchestra? He hadn't even thought about that part. Playing alone was one thing. Playing with an orchestra was completely different. They'd have to follow each other, breathe together, become one voice. What time? He asked, his voice rough. 9 o'clock. The conductor wants to meet you first. After Diana hung up, Robert sat there holding his phone. The conductor, a real conductor who'd worked with famous musicians all over the world. What would he think when he found out a janitor was replacing Victoria Cross? Robert arrived at the center at 8:30, wearing the same uniform he always wore. Blue pants, light blue shirt with his name tag. He realized with a sinking feeling that he didn't own a tuxedo. He didn't own any formal clothes at all. Diana met him at the staff entrance, and she must have seen the panic on his face. "It's okay," she said quickly. "We'll handle everything. The costume department has a tuxedo that should fit you. We'll get you sorted out." She led him to the rehearsal room where the conductor was waiting. Maestro Luis Rodriguez was a compact man in his 60s with silver hair and intense dark eyes. He looked Robert up and down, his expression unreadable. "You're the janitor," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," Robert replied, feeling about 2 inches tall. "Diana says you can play Rachmaninoff's Second. The whole thing. From memory?" "Yes, sir." Maestro Rodriguez crossed his arms. "I've been conducting for 40 years. I've worked with the best pianists in the world. And Diana wants me to believe that a janitor can step in and perform one of the most difficult concertos ever written with less than 12 hours' notice." Robert felt his face getting hot. "I understand if you don't think—" "Sit," the maestro interrupted, pointing at the piano in the corner of the rehearsal room. "Play the opening, just the first 2 minutes." Robert walked to the piano, his legs feeling weak. This was it, the moment of truth. He sat down, placed his hands on the keys, and began to play. The opening chords of Rachmaninoff's concerto filled the small room. Robert forgot about the maestro, forgot about his nerves, forgot about everything except the music. His fingers moved with certainty, expressing every emotion the composer had intended. When he finished the opening section, the room was silent. Robert looked up at Maestro Rodriguez. The conductor's expression had completely changed. His arms were uncrossed, and he was staring at Robert with something that looked like wonder. "Where did you study?" the maestro asked quietly. "I didn't really. I got into conservatory but couldn't afford to go. My grandmother taught me when I was young. The rest I learned on my own." "On your own," the maestro repeated, shaking his head. "Incredible. You have a gift, Mr. Chen. A real gift." Something tight in Robert's chest loosened a little. "Thank you, sir. The orchestra arrives at noon. We'll run through the entire piece together. Can you be ready?" Robert nodded, not trusting his voice. The next few hours passed in a blur. Diana took him to the costume department where a kind older woman named Helen fussed over him, pinning and adjusting a tuxedo until it fit properly. "You look very handsome," she said, smiling. "Like a real concert pianist." I am a real concert pianist, Robert thought, and for the first time he actually believed it. At noon, the orchestra members started arriving. Robert watched from backstage as they took their positions, tuning their instruments and shuffling their sheet music. They didn't know yet. They thought they were here for another rehearsal without a soloist. Maestro Rodriguez stepped onto the conductor's podium and raised his hands for attention. "Good afternoon, everyone. I have some news. We have a pianist for tonight's performance." Excited murmurs ran through the orchestra. "Who?" someone called out. "His name is Robert Chen, and he's been working here at the center for 12 years. Some of you may recognize him." The maestro gestured toward the wings, and Robert walked out onto the stage. He saw the exact moment when the orchestra members recognized him. Eyes widened, mouths dropped open. Someone whispered, "That's the janitor." Robert felt his face burning, but he walked to the piano and sat down. The familiar weight of the orchestra's attention pressed down on him. 75 musicians all staring, all wondering if this was some kind of joke. "Let's begin," Maestro Rodriguez said calmly. From the top, the conductor raised his baton. Robert placed his hands on the keys. And then the magic happened. From the very first notes, Robert and the orchestra connected. It was like they'd been playing together for years. The maestro's conducting was clear and expressive, and Robert followed him instinctively while the orchestra followed them both. The music swelled and softened, thundered and whispered exactly as it should. They played through the entire concerto without stopping. When the final chord faded away, there was a moment of stunned silence. Then the entire orchestra burst into spontaneous applause. The violinists tapped their bows against their music stands. The brass section cheered, and the percussionist actually stood up to clap. Robert felt tears prickling his eyes. This was what he'd been missing for 30 years. Maestro Rodriguez walked over to the piano and shook Robert's hand. That was extraordinary. Tonight will be special. Very special. The afternoon disappeared in more rehearsals, breaks, last-minute adjustments. Diana kept appearing with updates. The mayor would be attending, 3 television crews had asked to film. Someone from a major newspaper wanted an interview after the performance. Robert tried not to think about any of that. He focused on the music, running through difficult passages in his mind, feeling the weight of the keys under his fingers. At 5 p.m., Diana told him to go home and rest for a few hours. The performance starts at 8. Be back here by 6:30 to get ready. Robert went home but couldn't rest. He paced around his apartment, too nervous to sit still. He made tea but didn't drink it. He tried to eat but had no appetite. The clock on his wall seemed to tick louder than normal, each second bringing him closer to the moment that would either prove he belonged on that stage or prove he'd been fooling himself all along. At 6 p.m., he put on a clean shirt and headed back to the center. The building was already buzzing with activity. Catering staff rushed past with trays. Ushers in formal wear checked their stations. And the parking lot was starting to fill with expensive cars. Helen met him at the costume department and helped him into the tuxedo. She adjusted his bow tie, smoothed his jacket, and stepped back to look at him. "Perfect," she said. "You're going to be wonderful." Robert looked at himself in the mirror. He barely recognized the man staring back at him. Gone was the janitor in the blue uniform. In his place stood someone who looked like he belonged on a concert stage. But inside, he was still the same scared kid who'd given up his dreams 30 years ago. Diana appeared at 7:30. "The house is almost full. Everyone's here. Are you ready?" Was he ready? Robert didn't know. His hands were sweating, his heart was racing, and he felt like he might throw up. But he nodded anyway. "There's something you should know," Diana said. "Word got out somehow. About you. About your story. There are more people here than we expected. We had to open up the standing room sections." "How many people?" Robert asked. "About 950. 950. Robert gripped the back of a chair to steady himself. "You can do this," Diana said firmly. "I heard you play. The maestro heard you. The orchestra heard you. You're not just filling in for Victoria Cross, you're going to give them something special, something real." At 7:55, Robert stood in the wings, waiting. He could hear the murmur of the audience on the other side of the curtain. Nearly 1,000 voices, all talking and laughing, completely unaware that the janitor they'd been walking past for years was about to step onto that stage. The house lights dimmed. The audience quieted. Maestro Rodriguez walked out to applause, then gestured for the orchestra to stand and acknowledge the crowd. They sat back down, and the maestro turned to the wings, extending his hand toward Robert. This was it. No more hiding. No more playing for empty seats. Robert took a deep breath and walked out onto the stage. The spotlight hit him like a physical force, bright and hot and exposing. As his eyes adjusted, he could see the audience, row after row of faces. In the front rows, he saw people leaning forward, squinting, trying to figure out who he was. He heard whispers rippling through the crowd. "Who is that? Where's Victoria? Wait, is that?" Robert walked to the piano, his legs somehow carrying him forward, even though they felt like rubber. He sat down on the bench and adjusted it slightly, his hands trembling. The Steinway waited for him, patient as always. He looked up at Maestro Rodriguez, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. Then the conductor raised his baton. Robert placed his hands on the keys. And the entire world held its breath. Robert's fingers touched the piano keys, and for a split second his mind went completely blank. 950 people, all watching him, all waiting. The silence in the hall was so complete he could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then Maestro Rodriguez gave him that small nod again, and something inside Robert shifted. He wasn't a janitor anymore. He wasn't a scared 58-year-old man who'd given up his dreams. He was a musician. He'd always been a musician. The conductor's baton came down, and Robert began to play. The opening chords of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 erupted from the Steinway, powerful and commanding. Robert's nervousness evaporated the moment his fingers hit the keys. This was where he belonged. This was who he was meant to be. The orchestra came in right on cue, strings soaring, brass punctuating, all of it wrapping around the piano part like a conversation between old friends. Robert felt the music flowing through him, every note he'd practiced in secret for the past 2 years suddenly making perfect sense. In the audience, the whispers had stopped. People sat forward in their seats, completely captivated. Nobody cared anymore that the man at the piano was the janitor. They only cared about the music pouring out of him. The first movement built to its climax, Robert's hands flying across the keys, hitting every note with precision and passion. The technical difficulty of the piece demanded everything from him, but he gave it willingly. His grandmother had taught him that music wasn't just about hitting the right notes. It was about feeling them, living them, breathing them. As the first movement came to a close, Robert caught a glimpse of the audience. The front row was filled with the richest people in the city, the donors who'd paid $500 per ticket. A woman in a glittering dress had tears streaming down her face. A man in an expensive suit sat with his mouth slightly open, completely mesmerized. The second movement began, and this was Robert's favorite part. The melody was so beautiful it almost hurt. Soft and tender and full of longing. His fingers moved gently across the keys, coaxing out every ounce of emotion Rachmaninoff had poured into the composition over 100 years ago. The orchestra followed him perfectly, breathing when he breathed, swelling when he swelled. Maestro Rodriguez conducted with his eyes half closed, lost in the music. The entire hall felt like it was holding its breath, afraid to break the spell. Robert thought about his grandmother as he played. She'd been gone for 20 years now, but he could feel her presence somehow. She'd believed in him when nobody else did. She'd taught him that being poor didn't mean you couldn't create something beautiful. He wished she could see him now, finally playing the way she'd always known he could. The second movement faded into silence, and the audience didn't even shift in their seats. Then the third movement exploded into life, fast and technically brutal and triumphant. Robert's hands were a blur on the keys, dancing through passages that had taken him months to master. The orchestra matched his energy, driving forward with unstoppable momentum. Sweat beaded on Robert's forehead. His fingers ached, but he didn't care. This was the most alive he'd felt in 30 years. Every sacrifice, every night spent practicing alone, every moment of doubt, it all led to this. Right here, right now, the concerto built to its final climax. The orchestra and piano joining together in a massive wall of sound that filled every corner of the hall. Robert poured everything he had into the final measures, his whole body moving with the music, lost in the pure joy of it. And then it was over. The final chord rang out, sustained by the orchestra, and gradually faded into silence. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. The audience sat frozen, as if they couldn't quite believe what they'd just heard. Robert's hands remained on the keys, trembling, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Then someone in the back row stood up, then another person, then another. Within seconds, the entire audience was on their feet, and the applause that erupted was like thunder. It rolled through the hall in waves, growing louder and louder, shaking the very walls. Robert stood up from the piano bench, his legs wobbly, and turned to face the audience. The standing ovation continued, people clapping so hard their hands must have hurt. The orchestra members were standing too, joining the applause, smiling and nodding at him with genuine respect. Maestro Rodriguez grabbed Robert's hand and raised it high, presenting him to the audience like a champion. The applause grew even louder, impossible as that seemed. People were whistling, shouting, some were openly crying. Robert couldn't process it. His brain couldn't make sense of the sight before him. Nearly 1,000 people, all standing, all applauding, all celebrating him. The janitor they'd walked past without seeing for 12 years. The ovation went on and on. 5 minutes, 6 minutes, 7. People didn't want to stop. They didn't want the moment to end. Neither did Robert. Finally, after what felt like both an eternity and no time at all, the applause began to fade. People slowly sat back down, wiping their eyes, still buzzing with the energy of what they'd just witnessed. Robert made his way off the stage, his legs barely supporting him. Diana was waiting in the wings, tears streaming down her face. She didn't say anything, just pulled him into a tight hug. "You did it," she whispered. "You really did it." The rest of the gala passed in a blur. There were other performances, speeches, dinner being served in the lobby, but nobody could stop talking about the piano concerto, about the janitor who played like an angel. Robert changed out of the tuxedo and back into his regular clothes, expecting to slip away quietly the way he always did. But when he tried to leave through the staff entrance, Diana stopped him. "You need to come back out," she said. "People want to meet you." "I don't. I'm not good at that sort of thing," Robert protested. "I know. But you need to do it anyway. You've given them something special tonight. Let them thank you." Reluctantly, Robert followed Diana to the lobby. The moment he appeared, a crowd formed around him. The wealthy donors, the orchestra members, staff from the center, they all wanted to shake his hand, to tell him how moved they were, to ask him questions. "Where did you learn to play like that? How long have you been practicing? Why didn't anyone know about this? Have you ever recorded an album? Would you perform again?" Robert tried to answer, overwhelmed by the attention. A woman in an elegant black dress introduced herself as Patricia Wong, president of the city's symphony board. "Mr. Chen, I'd like to talk to you about performing with our symphony. We have a concert series in the spring." A man in glasses said he was from the local newspaper and wanted to do a feature story. Someone else said they worked for a classical music magazine. A woman asked if he'd be willing to teach at the community music school. Robert's head was spinning. This was too much, too fast. Just this morning, he'd been emptying trash cans and mopping floors, invisible to everyone around him. Now they were treating him like he was somebody important. "I'm sorry," he finally said, his voice shaking. "I'm sorry, I need some air." He pushed through the crowd as politely as he could and made his way outside. The cool night air hit his face, and he took deep breaths, trying to calm down. His phone buzzed in his pocket, then buzzed again, and again. He pulled it out and saw dozens of missed calls and text messages, friends he hadn't heard from in years, distant relatives, former co-workers. Somehow word was already spreading. Robert walked to the far end of the parking lot, away from the lights and the people. He found a bench and sat down, staring up at the stars. His hands were still trembling. His whole body was trembling. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. After 30 years of hiding, of playing only for himself, he'd stood on that stage and shown the world who he really was. And instead of laughing or rejecting him, they'd given him a standing ovation that lasted nearly 10 minutes. But now what? Tomorrow he was supposed to come back and clean these same floors, empty these same trash cans. Could he do that after tonight? Could he go back to being invisible after finally being seen? His phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Mr. Chen?" An unfamiliar voice. "My name is David Wu. I'm a producer with National Public Radio. Someone sent me a video of your performance tonight. I know this is last minute, but would you be available for an interview tomorrow? We'd like to feature your story on our morning show." Robert's mouth went dry. "National Public Radio?" "Yes, sir. Your story is remarkable. A janitor who's been hiding this incredible talent for years, finally getting his moment to shine. People need to hear about this." After Robert hung up, his phone immediately rang again, and then again. Producers, journalists, booking agents. It seemed like everyone in the world suddenly wanted to talk to him. He turned off his phone and just sat there in the darkness, trying to understand what was happening to his life. For 12 years, he'd existed in the shadows. Now suddenly he was standing in the brightest spotlight imaginable. It was terrifying, and thrilling, and overwhelming, and wonderful. Robert looked back at the Performing Arts Center, glowing in the night like a jewel. Through the windows he could see people still mingling, still talking, probably still talking about him. His whole life had changed in the span of 25 minutes. the length of one piano concerto. He thought about his grandmother again, about what she'd say if she could see him now. He knew exactly what she'd say. She'd smile that warm smile of hers and tell him the same thing she'd told him when he was 5 years old, sitting at that old upright piano for the first time. You see, Robert? I told you. Music is a gift, and gifts are meant to be shared. Robert sat on that bench for a long time, just breathing, just being. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new paths he couldn't even imagine yet. But tonight he'd done something he thought was impossible. Tonight, he'd finally come home. The video appeared online before Robert even made it home that night. Someone in the audience had recorded the entire performance on their phone. By midnight, it had 3,000 views. By morning, it had hit 500,000. By the end of the week, 12 million people around the world had watched the Janitor play Rachmaninoff. Robert's phone didn't stop ringing for 3 days straight. News channels wanted interviews. Concert halls wanted bookings. A recording company in New York offered him a contract. A talent agent left 7 voicemails. The mayor's office called to say they wanted to honor him at a special ceremony. It was overwhelming. Robert had gone from invisible to famous in less than 24 hours, and he had no idea how to handle it. On Monday morning, he showed up for work at the Riverside Performing Arts Center at his usual time, 5:30 a.m., wearing his blue janitor's uniform. He didn't know what else to do. This had been his routine for 12 years. Famous or not, the floors still needed mopping. But when he tried to unlock the supply closet, Diana appeared in the hallway, still wearing her coat like she'd just arrived. "Robert, what are you doing?" "Working," he said simply. "It's Monday. You can't... after everything..." Diana seemed at a loss for words. "Have you seen the video? Have you seen what people are saying about you?" Robert had seen some of it. The comments under the video made him uncomfortable. People calling him inspiring, a genius, proof that talent can't be hidden. Some comments made him cry. Others made him feel like a fraud. He was just a man who loved music. That was all. "I have a job to do," Robert said quietly. "People are counting on me." "Robert," Diana's voice was gentle. "The board of directors wants to meet with you this afternoon. They have a proposal. Will you at least hear them out?" That afternoon, Robert sat in the fancy boardroom on the top floor of the center, a room he'd cleaned dozens of times but never actually sat in. 12 board members faced him across a long mahogany table. These were the richest, most powerful people in the city's arts community. The board president, an elderly man named Mr. Thompson, spoke first. "Mr. Chen, what you did Saturday night was extraordinary. You've brought more attention to this center than we've had in 20 years. We'd like to offer you a new position." Robert's hands gripped his knees under the table. "A position?" "Artist in residence," Mr. Thompson explained. "You would perform here regularly, maybe once a month. But more importantly, you'd teach. We want to start a scholarship program for young people from low-income families, kids who have talent but can't afford lessons. You'd be perfect to lead it." Robert's throat tightened. "I'm not sure I'm qualified to teach. I never finished my formal training." A woman at the table, Mrs. Chang, shook her head. "That's exactly why you're qualified. You understand what these kids are going through. You've lived it. You can show them that their circumstances don't define their potential." They offered him a salary that was 3 times what he made as a janitor, health insurance, an office, access to all the center's practice rooms, the title of professor, even though he'd never been to college. "I need time to think," Robert said. That evening, Robert sat in his small apartment, staring at the walls he'd looked at for 20 years. His phone buzzed with another call from another reporter. He ignored it. Instead, he called his old friend Thomas, another janitor who worked at the hospital downtown. They'd known each other for 15 years. "Tom, it's Robert." "Robert, man, I saw the video. Everyone at the hospital is talking about you. You're famous." "Yeah." Robert rubbed his tired eyes. "Tom, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Am I still me? Like, if I'm not a janitor anymore? If I become this other thing, am I still the same person?" There was a pause. Then Tom said, "You were always a pianist, Rob. You were just also a janitor. Now you get to be what you always were, but out loud. That doesn't change who you are. That just means more people get to see it." Those words stayed with Robert all night. The next morning he called Mr. Thompson and accepted the position. The following months were like living in a whirlwind. Robert performed at the Riverside Center to sold-out crowds. He gave interviews to newspapers and radio shows. He played at 3 other concert halls in neighboring cities. A recording company released an album of him playing Chopin, and it actually made it onto some classical music charts. But the part that mattered most to Robert was the teaching. The scholarship program started with 15 kids. They ranged from 8 years old to 17. Some came from the poorest neighborhoods in the city. Others were children of immigrants working multiple jobs. All of them had talent but no way to develop it. Robert met them in the center's practice rooms twice a week. He taught them technique, theory, how to read music. But more importantly, he taught them that music belonged to everyone, not just the wealthy. Your talent doesn't care where you live or what your parents do for work, he told them on the first day. It only asks that you honor it, that you practice, that you work hard, and that you never let anyone tell you that you don't belong. One of his students was a 13-year-old girl named Lynn, who reminded Robert of himself at that age. She had that same hunger in her eyes, that same desperate need to make music. Her parents ran a small restaurant and worked 16-hour days. They couldn't afford a piano, so Lynn practiced on a keyboard she'd bought at a thrift store. Robert arranged for the center to stay open late twice a week so Lynn could practice on a real piano. Sometimes he stayed with her, offering guidance, but mostly he just let her play. He understood that sometimes you just needed time alone with the music. 6 months after Robert's famous performance, the center held a recital for the scholarship students. Robert sat in the audience this time, watching Lynn play a Mozart sonata with fierce concentration. She made a few mistakes, but she played with such heart that it didn't matter. The audience gave her a standing ovation, not as long as Robert's had been, but genuine and warm. Robert clapped until his hands hurt, tears running down his face. After the recital, Lynn's parents found Robert. Her mother grabbed his hands, her eyes red from crying. "Thank you," she said in accented English. "Thank you for seeing her." That's when Robert understood. This was why his gift had been hidden for so long. Not because he was meant to suffer, but because he needed to understand what it felt like to be invisible. He needed to know what it was like to have talent that nobody recognized, to be dismissed and overlooked, because now he could make sure these kids never felt that way. A year after the performance that changed his life, Robert stood on the stage of the Riverside Performing Arts Center once again. But this time he wasn't alone. 15 of his students performed with him, a special arrangement they'd been working on for months. Some played piano, others played violin, cello, flute, instruments the scholarship program had bought for them. The piece they chose was simple, something all of them could manage. But it was beautiful. And when they finished, the audience's applause was just as enthusiastic as it had been for Robert's Rachmaninoff. Backstage afterward, Robert gathered his students around him. "You did great," he told them. "Every single one of you. And I want you to remember something. A year ago I was mopping the floors in this building. People walked past me every day without seeing me. But I kept practicing. I kept believing. And when my moment came, I was ready." He looked at each of their faces. "Your moments are coming, maybe not this year or next year, maybe not for a long time, but they're coming. And when they do, you'll be ready too. Because talent doesn't care about timing. It just cares that you never give up." Lynn raised her hand. "Mr. Chen, do you ever miss being a janitor?" Robert smiled. "You know what? Sometimes I do. There was something peaceful about those early mornings when it was just me in the empty building. But I don't miss being invisible. And thanks to all of you, I never will be again." That night, after everyone had gone home, Robert did something he hadn't done in over a year. He walked into the main concert hall, now as a professor and performer, and sat at the Steinway piano. The same piano he'd played in secret for so many years. He played softly, just for himself like he used to. A Chopin nocturne, gentle and reflective. The notes floated up to the empty seats, to the crystal chandeliers, to the high ceiling. But the seats weren't really empty anymore. Robert could feel the presence of everyone who'd been part of his journey. His grandmother, who'd first taught him to play. Diana, who'd given him his chance. The students who looked up to him now. The thousands of people who'd been touched by his story. He finished playing and sat in the silence, his hands resting on the keys. His life hadn't turned out the way he'd planned when he was young, He'd spent 30 years taking a much longer, harder road than he'd expected, but maybe that was okay. Maybe he'd needed to walk through those years of hiding to appreciate this moment of being seen. Maybe all those nights playing for empty chairs had prepared him to play for the one audience that really mattered now. Those 15 kids who needed someone to believe in them. Robert stood up from the piano, adjusted the bench exactly the way he liked it, and walked toward the exit. Tomorrow he had 3 students coming for lessons. Next week he had another performance. Next month, 5 more scholarships to award. His life was full now. Full of music, full of purpose, full of hope. And for the first time in a very long time, Robert Chen felt completely, perfectly at peace. And in the end, that was the only reason that really mattered.